Last Sunday, I continued my series on some major eras where God showed His power and His glory so that we can be reminded of what God is able to do in our own lives. One of the most important things when we read the Bible and we see the mighty things that God has done is to understand that means He can perform miracles in our own lives. When we have kids that have run off and have gotten into things that aren't good for them, that are wrong, we can pray to God, and in His time, He can perform mighty miracles. It's unfortunate that we don't think He's doing it quick enough. But God is active in our world today. And so, the first week, when I started this series, we looked at what is called the Abrahamic Age. And that was, or the Adamic Covenant, and that was the time of the Garden of Eden and Adam. And so then we moved to the next age last week, and we saw the Noachic age, so the time of Noah. And we're going to move to the third age this morning. It's called the Abrahamic Age. And we will continue that series by taking a good look at God's covenant with Abraham, the father of nations. And before I start this verse, I want to say that this was the hardest sermon. This one and next week's are the hardest ones for me to do. Not because it's difficult to figure out what to say. It's difficult to cut it out. Because Abraham had so many things go on in his life that are central to who he was, and in some cases, central to who Christ is, and central to who we are. And so it's difficult. I was up, Paul will tell you, I was up till past 2 o'clock in the morning on Friday night, Saturday morning, because I kept writing stuff and then zeroing it out because I realized you just can't include everything. But we are going to hit a few spots of Abraham's life. And so, in chapter 12, verse 1 through 3, he says, "Go from your country," this is God speaking, "go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." There's a lot of blessing going on there, isn't there? And it is really an incredible blessing. Not only does the Lord of all creation decide to talk directly to Abraham, who may not have even known who he was. He came from Ur of the Chaldeans. And if you know any of that, it was part of, I believe it's Persia, but it was part of a pagan culture. And they had many, many gods. And God could have just been one of the many that he knew of. But somehow, and for some reason, God reached out and picked Abraham. And he spoke directly to him. And not only just that, but he tells Abraham that he's going to bless him with the most important blessings that a man of that time could want. Sons that will turn into descendants, that will turn into nations. There was nothing worse in that culture for a woman than to be barren, without children. There was nothing worse for a man than to have no one to leave everything that he owned to. No one to carry on his name and his culture. You were looked upon very badly if you were in that situation. And here is Abraham in his 70s, God speaks to him for the first time. Now, I don't know about you, but I find a lot of things in the Bible to be very uplifting that maybe other people don't. Because, say, I didn't enter the ministry as a pastor until my 50s, and I thought, man, I'm so late. But here's Abraham. He doesn't even hear the voice of God until his 70s. Moses was nearly 80 when he heard the voice of God. And here we go. He tells Abraham to go somewhere. But he's not specific. And he gives him a promise in return for obedience. Now, I want to pull out something that just hit me as I was reading this whole before it and after it and stuff. In the previous chapter, the Bible is going through genealogy, and then it hits on Abram's father, Terah. See, they had lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, but Terah had picked up his family, and that always means extended family. And he had picked up his family and begun to go towards the land of Canaan, which, oddly enough, is the exact destination that God wanted Abram to go to. Did you find that interesting? That his dad was already starting to go there, and then he got stuck in Haran, and they laid kind of all of their people there and stopped. But his idea was to go to Canaan. Isn't that weird? That he had the idea that God was fulfilling in Abram. Have you ever wondered how often God just puts a little seed in your heart? Says, I need you to do this. I need you to go here. And maybe you don't hear it as a voice or something like that, but you just know, and it's time for me to go. And I find that really interesting that Terah was already on his way. And then he stopped. And then God calls Abram. And Abram just goes. And one of the great things, if you listen to contemporary Christian music, one of the phrases that seems to be popping up is God is for us. He is not against us. Have you guys heard that in songs? Right? I know Chris Tomlin has one that he says that, but a bunch of people have something that says God is for us. That is exactly what he's telling Abram. He tells him that whoever blesses you, I'll bless. And whoever curses you, I'll curse. He's telling Abram, I'm on your side. If only you'll be obedient to the call. If I were to have to try to tell someone, a young person who's a Christian, and keep it short, something that would be short, I think I would tell them to seek God's will for their lives and then be obedient. Far too often we start thinking about what God's will is for our lives way too late in life. By the time we come to think about asking God, we've already messed it up. Anybody know people that we were talking about this morning, about somebody getting in, they've got a leak in a faucet, and by the time, I've seen commercials of that, by the time they get through, the thing's exploding all over, right? And then they call the plumber? Right? That's what we do in our lives. Far too often, we don't bother to ask God, well, is this something you wanted me to do in the first place? Be obedient to the call. And does that mean you're not going to have to work at things that maybe you won't like? Of course not. I think, I know years ago I had looked at it, the percentage of people that work jobs that they can't stand is super high. And why is that? Because you still got to make a living. You still have to make a living. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can't answer God's call. Abram did what God asked him to do, but he still did all the other things that his life and his world required. Still had sheep and cattle and, I don't know, camels, whatever they all had. They had flocks, lots of them. So as Abram and his nephew, we move down through the story, as Abram and his nephew Lot, they continued to prosper wherever they went. They just grew. And they kept growing. Their flocks became too large for one area to accommodate. And I'm talking about a big area. So Abram told Lot to pick where he wanted to settle. And he said he would go the other way. And it says, Lot looked about him and saw that the plain of the Jordan was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord. Like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar, this was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the plain of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the plain and moved his tent as far as Sodom. I want you to notice two things about Lot's choice. Lot was Abram's nephew and was probably thought of more as a brother because Lot's father had died and Abram's father took him in. And so they were more like brothers, and Abram would have been the elder brother. But rather than give the prime location to his uncle that had taken him under his wing, Lot chose what seemed to be the best land for himself. And number two, the land that was supposedly not the better of the two locations was actually the land that God would eventually give to the Israelites. And it was called a land flowing of milk and honey. See, Lot's character was to choose the best for himself. He operated out of selfishness, while Abram operated out of love and generosity. Lot thought that he was getting the best part of the bargain. However, we know from what happened to Lot that that was just not the case. I think that there are many times that we think that if we allow people to have their way with us, we will somehow be swindled out of something that we deserve. Do y'all think that way? Because every once in a while I think that way. Every time I call DirecTV, actually. Pretty much. Right? Somehow, I'm not going to get the best end of this deal. I know. See, the world would like to do that to us every chance they get. We've all heard all the stories. Oh, you won't bake a cake for this person. We're taking your business. But God has also told us that all things work together for good to those that love God. Abram ended up settling exactly where God wanted him to be. Isn't that great? It was the other person's choice, and still he ended up exactly where God wanted him to be. Verse 14. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, raise your eyes now, and look from the place where you are, northward, and southward, and eastward, and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I'll make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Rise up, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. When God first addressed Abram, he promised him children, and lots of them. This time, God reiterates that promise, but also tells Abram that all the land that he could see and more would be his. I always think of those old John Wayne movies where John Wayne was the owner of a ranch, and everything that you could see belonged to him. So that's what he tells Abram to do. Everything you see is going to be yours. When the area that Lot lived in was attacked by other armies, and Lot and his family was taken captive along with a bunch of other people, Abram went after them. Now, when I say attackers, I mean 5 armies. 5 armies of 5 cities had gone in and attacked Sodom and Gomorrah and had taken off women and children and other people as servants, all this kind of stuff, and taken a lot of goods. 5 armies. Abram goes out to fight them and his people. That kind of gives you a clue about how many people he had working for him, doesn't it? And he goes off and he defeats the armies of the invaders. You see, even though Lot thought he had done him dirty, that's a Texas thing. Lot thought he had done him dirty, but even then, Abram continued to look after Lot. One of the things that I always point out is that the fathers of our faith were not perfect people. They made mistakes just as you and I do. And Abraham was no exception. He had an issue with honesty when he felt threatened. He half lied about his wife, Sarah, being his sister. Now, I had said that Lot was actually his nephew. Well, Sarah was Lot's sister. So in truth, she was his niece. But again, his father had taken them in so they were treated more like brother and sister. So he tells, when he thinks that people are going to attack him because of her beauty, he tells her, tell him that you're my sister. He had a little bit of an honesty problem. It was like a half-truth, you know? Though God had promised Abram that he would have a son, he hedged his bet with the then common custom of taking the wife's handmaiden and having her bear your son and call it yours and your wife's. It was very common in the cultures of that day. And I call this our little episode of Help God Out. And because of this little episode of Help God Out, the Arab races were born and have caused children of Israel all sorts of problems to this very day. And they will continue to battle with them until the return of Christ. Isn't that amazing? One little mistake. One time where Abram said, you know, I know God said, yeah, we could do this, but I think we got a way that we can help him and get this done. And we got all of the Arab races. Ishmael is the father of the Arab races. Though Abram had been unable to wait on God, God was still faithful to his promises. And God changes Abram's name. His name, Abram, meant exalted ancestor. And he changes it to Abraham, and that means an ancestor of a multitude. And then 90-year-old Sarah gave birth. I love what Chuck Swindoll said one time. It takes a lot of coordination to handle a walker and a stroller at the same time. And he was Daddy's pride and joy. But the time came when God believed that Abraham's priorities were ready to be tested. Did you know that God usually doesn't test the people that are young in their faith in something great because they need time. They need learning. They need knowledge. They need grace. They need wisdom. But he waited until this point, until he knew that Abraham had something that he really loved a whole lot. Do you have something like that? Or someone? Most of us have someone or something that we love a whole lot. And the real question is, would we put that before God? Before you answer that, think about this. If God asked you just to sell everything and move to Africa because he had something important for you to do, would you do it? Now, I'm pretty much guessing that you're thinking, well, if he actually yelled down to me and I could hear the voice and knew for certain that it was him, yeah, I do. But none of this little whispers. Now, you're going to have to pound that into me pretty much. I remember when I entered the ministry and Paula said, listen, I will support you in your pastorate, but if you get called to a third world country, write often. That's a hard question even for me. God had already asked Abraham to do that. And now he was asking for the ultimate sacrifice. And he says this, after these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. If you do, I found something really interesting in kind of delving into this. Isaac could have been as old as 36 years old when this happened. How many of you think of him as a 12-year-old boy? Yeah, right? It never says that he's young. It says that the servants are young, but it doesn't say he's young. And they try to figure out the timeline by when Sarah dies. And they said he could have been as old as 36. Isn't that amazing? So it wasn't like Isaac couldn't have said, oh, whoa, dude. But let me explain something here. This, again, was a normal part of pagan religions. You'll find it in the Bible where it says, where they put their sons through the fire. They burn their kids. And so this would not have seemed quite as crazy to Abram as it does to us. Now, God had promised Abraham uncountable descendants. They're going to be so many, they're like the sand. And now God was asking Abram to give all that up. The writer of Hebrews says that Abraham believed that God would simply raise Isaac up from the dead. He never doubted that God would be faithful to his word. He just had in his mind how God is going to... Have you ever done that? Oh, I know that God told me this is going to happen, so this is how he's going to do it. Ooh. Doesn't happen that way. And so God, we know the story, God stops Abraham from completing the sacrifice. But by then, God knew, and more importantly, Abraham knew, that there was nothing that Abraham placed a higher value on than his submission to God. Can you say that? Can you say that there is absolutely nothing that God might ask of you to give up that you wouldn't be willing to give to him? That's a hard question. But here's something interesting. Abraham understood that God might take something away, but would certainly give back far more. But would you be ready to trust like that? God consistently showed his goodness to Abraham. That's why we sang those songs this morning. God, even though Abraham stumbled a little bit on the way, did a couple things that were wrong, his heart wanted to do what God wanted him to do. In Nazarene terms, we call that heart holiness. It means that though King David, really blew it, his heart was such that God said, he's the apple of my eye. His heart wanted to do what God wanted him to do. And I love that song where it says, what I sing on the mountaintop, I'll sing in the valleys. That's great. Because that's what God calls us to do. Faith, love, no matter the circumstances. Thankfulness, no matter the circumstances. Can you be thankful to God? Not for the storms. Nobody's thankful for the storm. But to be able to thank him in the storm. That's the part that God wants from you. Has he been faithful to you? I was talking to Norma last week. God performed a work in their lives. God is faithful to us. Sometimes when we don't seem to deserve it, we've blown it, we've fallen, we stumble, and yet God picks us up, puts us back on the path, and says, I love you. Can you look at the things in your life and see God's goodness? That's what he's asking us to do this week, and that's what I'm asking you to do. Look at the things in your lives and say, you know what, God is so good.